Hi everyone, I hope you're having a great month. Tutors often come to me to ask for advice in teaching grammar. So today we're going to look at how we can integrate grammar instruction into our lesson plans while still using ELA best practices like relevant lesson topics, activating background knowledge, using authentic materials, and maximizing student talk time. Here's a situation that is quite common. Kate has spent a long time explaining how to form negative statements in English. And in class, Anna and the other students have spent hours using don't and doesn't to make negative statements in the present tense. I am finally certain that everyone can produce negative statements perfectly. Yay! And then an hour later, Anna calls me to tell me that she'll be absent the next day because her car is in the shop. And I say, "Oh, Anna, do you live near the library?" And she says, "No, teacher, I no live near the library." Oh! So what happened? Let's look at some possible explanations. We're going to talk about 3 different approaches to teaching grammar today because, as we know, our beliefs about how language is learned and how it should be taught fundamentally impact all of the other decisions that we make in our lesson planning and teaching. So as we go along, think about which of these you have experienced as a language learner. The first is the grammar translation approach. And to give an example from my own language learning, I took a U of A Spanish class. And in this class, it was very, very teacher-centered, and the teacher was quite scary. There was a lot of focus on grammar, and she was always throwing out grammatical terms that we didn't really know. We did a lot of very mechanical grammar worksheets, and even though I was an adult and a language teacher, I still felt very nervous and stressed and unmotivated. And I got an A. I passed all the tests, but I did not develop communication skills in Spanish. The second approach we'll talk about is the pure communicative approach. And this is based on the idea that as children, we don't receive grammar instruction when we're learning our native language. We just hear the language around us and we acquire it. And when our parents correct our grammar, it really has little impact on what we actually say. And eventually we acquire the correct grammar anyway. So this is the idea that with lots of input, specifically comprehensible input, which means input that is just above the learner's level, that learners will naturally acquire the grammar. And teachers who adopt this definition assume that students will just absorb the grammar rules through communication activities. But is input enough? As adult language learners, we tend to focus on the meaning of the input and not on the grammatical forms. And this makes me think of my time in the Peace Corps in Mauritania. To make a long story short, I served for almost 2 years in Chad, but then we were evacuated and I chose to continue my service in Mauritania. But because I arrived out of sync with the training, the new volunteer training cycle, I was just plunked down in my town without language or culture training. And so this meant that I was in total immersion, starting from almost 0 in Arabic, with no English speakers and no French speakers around for support. And so I had to learn Hassaniya, which was the local Arabic dialect, on the fly by scribbling down what I heard with the alphabet that I know, trying to make sense of it. And to this day, I have no understanding of Arabic grammar or the alphabet, which would have really accelerated my learning. But another important part of this experience was that it was so exhausting and upsetting and frustrating to be communicating at the level of a child, because I wasn't taken seriously, I couldn't make jokes. It was like my identity and my personality were shut down because I didn't have the language to truly express myself. And it was crushing. So it's important to remember that just like my experience in the Peace Corps, our adult language learners, English language learners, are full contributing members of their community in their own language. They have very real, very time-bound needs and desires for accuracy in their grammar, like getting a job, talking to their boss, etc. And as adults, they're very aware of how they are perceived by native speakers, which leads them to be very motivated English language learners. So how can we best show our respect for their identities and their lived experiences while supporting their English language acquisition? The third approach to teaching grammar can be called the communicative competence approach. And communicative competence is the ability to use language effectively to communicate in a variety of contexts. And grammar is important in this approach because it can enhance or impair our ability to communicate our message. So let's look at some examples here. This is a photo that I took when I was in China for work. This was in a park. And the way I interpreted this was don't step on the grass or don't throw trash or something. But the message was impaired by the English grammar or by the word choice. I have no idea, like it's hard to interpret really what they're saying here. Here's another example where grammar fundamentally changes the message that's being sent. So teachers in the communicative competence approach recognize that grammar is not good or bad, but rather it's a tool that helps us communicate, and it can either help or impair that communication. So the communicative competence model balances the extremes of the traditional grammar translation approach and the pure no grammar communicative approach with something that recognizes the importance of grammar but embeds it in a larger communicative context. Teachers who ascribe to the communicative competence approach recognize that overt grammar instruction helps students acquire the language more efficiently, but it embeds that grammar instruction in a larger communicative context, so in the context of a real communication task. Remember that grammar is just one aspect of communication, not a bunch of stressful stuff to memorize and drill. So take that pressure off of yourself and off of your students because English grammar is wacky and stressful enough as it is. So let's go back to our common situation. What went wrong? Well, in this situation, I was drilling and doing worksheets, which is good. It helps students memorize form, but it doesn't help them integrate that form into real communication. This is a long process that requires lots of real supported application of the grammar point. So drilling and worksheets are an important part of that process, but they are not the beginning of it and they are not the end of it. Rather, drilling and worksheets are embedded within the context of real reasons for communication. You are likely sitting there asking yourself, okay, so how do I do this? Well, I could explain it here, but just like explaining a grammar point, me blabbing at you about this approach isn't going to be super effective. In reality, you need to see it modeled and interact with it in context to really acquire this approach. So, to see it modeled by experienced teachers, I recommend that you watch the 2 class videos in this newsletter. And in order to interact with it in a real context, give me a call when you have a grammar point that you'd like to teach. I can help with lesson planning, I can come out and teach the lesson, or we can do some coaching about how to use this approach. If you're racking your brain of trying to come up with engaging, communicative grammar activities to help students practice using the grammar they're studying, I encourage you to check out what is possibly my favorite grammar resource. It's called Fun with Grammar, and I made a video about how to access and use this resource, and it's in this newsletter. So in conclusion, remember that when we teach grammar in a contextualized way that recognizes that grammar is only one component of effective communication, we show our respect for our students and their experiences while using ELA best practices like relevant lesson topics, activating background knowledge, using authentic materials, and maximizing student talk time. Thanks for all that you do. Please don't hesitate to give me a call or drop me a line, and have a great month.